welcome to the Reverend Hunter Podcast. This is Tony Jones. I'm the Reverend Hunter, and this is episode number 101. Thanks to all of you. I really did hear from a bunch of people after episode 100. I hope it didn't sound too pathetic. It was a tough time. It still is a tough time. I'm still, I'd say, getting my bearings after Allie's death. Her death and then the service really consumed, I'd say, all of my emotional energy for all of June and July. Here we are in early August, ready to kick off some great podcasting for the fall. I've got a bunch of guests lined up. I'm back in the saddle. I appreciate everybody's patience as first the book and then family stuff really took over for me. But here we are, ready for an autumn of hunting and fishing, ready for a lot of great conversations. It's going to be fantastic. And we lead off with just a great conversation with Sam Shephard. He's a professor at Ave Maria University in Florida. And what a fantastic guy. And it turns out we have a lot in common. I reached out to him because I saw a link to his article on Twitter randomly, I guess, as he explains in an interview, maybe because it was hashtagged hunting. And so Twitter/X served it up to me. I thought, wow, that's interesting. The argument in the article, which is linked in the show notes, is that the hunting and killing and fishing and killing and consumption of wild animals and fish leads to better stewardship. And this is on a purely like secular academic level. You know, it makes better stewards of people. People care more about the environment, care more about wildlife, care more about habitat and things like that if they're consumptive outdoors enthusiasts. If they're involved, as the article says, in the bloody kill. So that's right up my alley, man. And I reached out to Sam, and he wrote back very quickly saying that he had just read my book and he'd love to come on the podcast. So here we have it. What do we call this? Should we call this season 2? Was season 1 100 episodes, and now we're launching season 2 or chapter 2 of the Reverend Hunter podcast, launching it here with Sam Shephard. Thanks, as always, for listening to the Reverend Hunter podcast. You can send me feedback through any social media, DMs, PMs, etc. You can follow me on all the socials. Please rate, review, subscribe to the Reverend Hunter podcast. That really helps us a lot. If you just go on to Apple Music and give a 5-star review and maybe, voice to text a little something about how much you love it, that'd be fantastic. Thanks for your support. Here's my conversation with Sam Shephard. Hey, Sam. Thanks for coming on the Reverend Hunter podcast.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you.
Well, I want to back up and hear kind of how you got to where you are today, but I will just say to listeners, it was pretty wild because I saw your article, your recent journal article about hunting and fishing and stewardship on Twitter. One of your co-authors, I think. It's not even someone I think I follow. I think Elon hasn't completely ruined Twitter because it did show me something of value, and that was your article.
Oh, yeah. I think he cunningly hashtag hunting in there, probably.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I mean, on Instagram, there's a lot of hunting and fishing content, not so much on Twitter. So maybe that's why. Maybe I'm one of the few. Before we even get to that, I just want to say the article, I was surprised at your co-authors.
Sure.
From Stockholm, Berlin, Prague. That's not... I've been trying to figure out ways to hunt in Europe, and here's what I'll tell you what my publisher told me. Actually, the London office of my publisher, I said I'd like to do a little book tour around the UK and do some hunting and whatever, and their response was, this is my publisher saying, nobody hunts
in Europe, and everybody hates guns. So don't bother coming over here to promote your book. Anyway, I say all that prolegomena to ask you, how in the world did you get collected with that group of people?
Yeah, one person I've worked with before, Robert Arlinghaus, he's the guy who did the Twitter post, and he's a really cool professor in Berlin in Germany. Most of his work's in fisheries, social ecological systems. So he started off more as a biologist, but became very interested quickly in the people aspect, of course, because fisheries and hunting's all about people, really, isn't it? Or at least it's all about the way we think about it. And we published a paper 2 years ago in which I wanted to assert or explore how it is that fishermen, anglers, can be really good stewards of nature. So that was the first paper.
Okay.
And that was really cool. We worked with this Charles List, actually, Chuck List, who's the philosopher who's on this current paper as well. And that paper took a long time to work, but actually it's been quite successful. But in that paper, we proposed very briefly this idea of the kill, that there's something about killing wild animals which is a very significant threshold moment in becoming a good steward. And it was just a kind of one paragraph hint, basically. And then after that paper was published in 2023, I think, and started to get some good traction, I thought, right, now we've got to really pursue this idea of the kill and see if we can work it. And we knew it was going to be pretty controversial, but I suggested it to Robert, and he was kind of interested. And then Chuck came on board as well. But we didn't have a lot of academic experience with hunting. I was a commercial fisherman. I've worked always in fisheries mainly, although I've done quite a lot of hunting. And so we were sort of looking for people who might be interested. And we needed a sociologist, which turned out to be Erica von Essen from the Stockholm Sustainability place. And then we also needed an anthropologist, because I wanted someone who was able to and willing to write in a more sort of narrative way about the kind of embodied, embedded experience of hunting. And Torsten came on board as well. So actually, me and Chuck are the only ones that hunt, and I think all of us fish.
Okay.
But yeah, and the others were a bit more, what's the expression? Slightly conservative about how willing they were to make bold statements about hunting and stewardship. But it was a really good collaboration in the end, and I'm glad we worked together.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so we'll get back to the article, which is what brought us together. But based on your accent, I'm guessing you're not originally from Florida. So trace me your journey from wherever you started to Ave Maria in Florida.
Yeah, that could be a story nearly as long as your book. But briefly, so I was raised in Skye, which is a little island in the northwest of Scotland. Very kind of gnarly, remote little place. It's now become like a tourist icon. It's all over Instagram and everything. But back when I was young, it was the middle of nowhere, and you lived on fish and turnips, basically.
I think there was a 60 Minutes story on the Isle of Skye recently, wasn't there?
I don't know. I've sort of lost track, really, but everyone goes there. And it's just weird how it's changed. What's wonderful is that all the Instagram tourists go to the same 3 places, whereas they've left it. If you're not, if something isn't highlighted on the internet, nobody goes there. So there's still lots of secrecy, and I can still hide in the same place I used to hide. But I left there when I was 17 and moved to London for the bright lights. My parents were total hippies, so I was all about Soho and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Stayed there for a while and did my first degree in environmental science. And then when I was 20, I went to India. Actually, it just felt like kind of wandering around for a while doing the barefoot thing. There's obviously quite a lot to fill in the gaps here, but I'll just keep moving. And I ended up then, when I was 23, I was on a kind of open-ended surf trip. And I ended up in the west of Ireland with a friend. There's really good waves there, and met a girl, of course. That's what happened. Met this lady called Anna. We just had our 25th wedding anniversary.
Wow.
But it turned out that her dad and 2 of her brothers were commercial fishermen. And I had kind of nowhere to go and nothing to do. So first of all, the dad gave me £25 a week and a place to sleep on the floor, and I worked in the garden. And then a berth came up on the boat and I went fishing with them. And it was that bit of time commercial fishing that kind of beat me into shape. It's very good discipline, bit of virtue, bit of formation, really.
Makes for good reality TV as well, it turns out.
Oh, all that sort of thing. Yeah.
You can see why, though, that's some high drama on those boats,
Well, it's kind of X-rated drama, But that's good. It's good company of men, in a way. It's the same sort of thing as hunting and fishing, in that you are out in the middle of nowhere with a very difficult, slightly dangerous task.
Yeah.
But also a rather simple task in a way. You leave everything behind. All you've got to do is catch fish and keep yourself alive. But yeah, so when I was out there fishing, I started hearing about all these fishermen talking about how the stocks were collapsing and all these environmental issues. But it was interesting because I'd always been interested in environmentalism and concerned about the well-being of nature. But now I was seeing it from the perspective of people who worked out there and who actually relied on consuming nature for their welfare. They're not just like, we're going to retreat and conserve. We're part of this. We're engaged with this. We need these fisheries. And now we actually have a really profound personal imperative to look after them. So this is where I started thinking about stewardship as opposed to conservation. So anyway, I fished with them for a while. Anna didn't want me to be a fisherman, having been brought up in a fishing family. It's just it's too difficult for family life. So I went off and did my PhD in fisheries, Mississippi State, and catfish in the Mississippi.
Okay.
And since then it's 25 years ago or something. Now I've been working in fisheries, social ecological systems around the world. So most of my work now is either recreational fisheries in Western countries or indigenous hunting and fishing systems in places like Guyana and the Democratic Republic of Congo and that sort of thing. So yeah.
When you say your work, do you mean when you say your work is in those fisheries, do you mean your research or because
when I left fishing and I decided, okay, I want to be involved with this system. I want to be a steward of this system, but I can't do it as a fisherman. I need to become a scientist, basically.
Okay.
So now, when I talk about work, it's research and writing work, really.
Okay. Guyana, I watched, there was a Meat Eater episode of Steve Ranella fishing there, and
really?
I think it's a couple episodes, and it was not a place that I'd thought of for would be on someone's fishing bucket list. And actually, after watching him fish out of carved out canoes with spears, it's like that's different next level kind of fishing.
It's a wonderful place. It really is a wonderful place. Yeah, you fly to Georgetown, which is on the coast, and then you fly inland for about an hour and a half. Then you get out of the little aeroplane, you get on a truck, and you drive on a dirt road for 3 hours. Then you get on a dugout canoe, and you go, well, now it's an aluminium boat, but yeah, and you go down the river for 2 or 3 hours. Then you get to these communities.
Wow.
But it's actually very cool. So it's kind of cool and a bit sad in a way, in that it feels like Sky actually 40 years ago, that they're seeing the disintegration of a lot of their traditional way of living. A lot of the kids just want to leave. They want to see the world, of course, not surprisingly. And they're trying to figure out how to live now that their indigenous traditional stewardship mechanisms aren't so successful because the system's become really open. But this one community, it's a place called Rewa, and I wonder if that's where Steve went. They set up a really successful guided fishing for arapaima, these really huge Amazonian fish that grow to 8 feet long. You fly fish for them in a pond, and it's a pretty phenomenal experience.
Wow.
I didn't do it, but I have worked a bit with this community. Yeah, it's a really lovely place. They're great people.
And tell me, what have you learned about fishing by spending time there? Personally, for your own personal practice of fishing.
I think I've kind of learned the same thing. Well, it's been reaffirmed to me the same thing that I already knew, which is the person who catches the most fish is likely to be the person who's most profoundly integrated in the system and who understands it most and who can anticipate the ecological processes best. So there's always there's someone who's better at fishing than everywhere else. It's like you go out with your friends, there's probably someone who's better than most of the rest of you.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, well, why is that? Why the heck do you always catch more fish than me? But yeah, I think it's something about how they see and understand and are integrated into the system. And
what are they losing? You say they're. I'm sure that them being on a Netflix show doesn't help, but maybe it's inevitable.
I think there's pros and cons to that because, basically what's happened is what happens in all of these situations is the system becomes much more open. So traditionally, all of their stewardship structures, their social stewardship structures worked because the system was relatively closed, which meant there was a lot of social forcing on behavior, right? If you fish in the wrong place, you take too many deer or something like that, your friends will find out, and then there's a sort of series of consequences, which are sufficiently onerous in the end that you do what you're told. Now we have a lot of people coming in from the outside, so for logging and gold mining and all that sort of thing. So they're having to reassess how they can hold on to what's best about their indigenous past, but also operate in a much bigger system. So the program I've been working with is really cool. It's called the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. It's funded by the FAO and by the EU. And what they've been doing is trying to set up government level legislation, which will kind of support the local indigenous people in living the way they want to be, but while protecting them from these higher level pressures. So in a way, what they're losing is the integrity of their communities to some extent. What they're gaining is a lot of opportunities. So I think they see things like these guided fishing as an opportunity, a way of being able to stay where they want to be and live essentially as they want to, but with the money they need and the opportunities for their kids and that sort of thing. So, yeah, trade-offs.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is these trade-offs come at us fast and furious in modern society for sure. Okay, I want to ask you about, well, this may seem like a self-serving question, but it's not. That's not how I mean it. Because when I wrote you wrote back and said, wow, this is crazy. I just read your book, and when I invited you on the podcast to talk about this academic paper. So before we get to that, I mean, all I know of you is like looking you up on the internet and reading an academic paper. Meanwhile, you've read my memoir, so I feel kind of like naked, like you know everything about me. But you said in that email, you said, I think it'd be very cool. I think we'd have a lot to talk about. So having known you only through an academic article, what is it that you think, where do you think those intersections are? And I'm not just asking you to say what you like about my book.
And I thought there was a lot of good in it. But what I thought particularly struck me about it was that you seem to, and I may be wrong, but you seem to arrive at an anthropology, basically, or an understanding of person and nature, which is very much in common with what sustainability scientists call relational. Which is also, I think, which is more or less the way that I consider the structure of humans and the rest of nature, in which we're profoundly and intricately linked to the system in all sorts of different ways, and which is not, at least not in a kind of superficial way, dualistic at all, which is very experiential, very embodied, very dynamic. And as I was reading towards the end of the book, I thought, yeah, this makes sense. And this is really a kind of an anthropology which is very much in common with what I was writing about in the paper, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I saw a lot of overlaps when I read the paper. And I wish I'd had it to like footnote it in my book. One thing I would say is like, you don't shy away from, you use the phrase bloody kill, which I found fascinating in a scholarly article because, academics have a tendency to use, it drove me crazy as an editor who's trying to edit their books, but use a lot of auxiliary verbs. In this article, we would like to argue that, like always at a remove from like, we're not actually saying anything. We're just saying that we might be saying something. And you not only make explicit arguments in the paper, but I think as any good academic article, you avoid euphemisms for death. You talk about a bloody kill. You don't try to couch it in, 50 Cent PhD words, bloody kill in an academic article. I think that's a little, that I wonder if that catches people off guard or not.
I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what a lot of hunters really think about hunting and how they present hunting and fishing to the general public. We tend to sanitize what we do, don't we? Because we think that's actually going to make it more acceptable. Whereas I think there's a huge loss there. And part of what this paper was trying to express was that it's exactly this bloodiness, this immediate death and blood and guts and earthiness and kind of pressing emotional moral imperatives, which is what's good about hunting, because that's what flips us into this care and understanding and this realization of the imperative for taking responsibility and good stewards. So, I wanted to say this is good. This is the reality. We are predators, and that's not just something we should hide. It's something we should actually fully recognize, and it'll be fruitful if we do so.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I mean, you're answering a question that I've struggled to answer for a long time. And I think me writing the book was honestly in part trying to answer that question.
Yeah, I like that.
Because people are like, oh, okay, so you're not really religious anymore. Now you just like killing animals or something like that. And I would say, oh, it's more than that. You know, there's something, but it wasn't, I think, until for me, and you guys talk about this in the article about butchering, you know, that being a part of this process and consumption more than somebody who trophy hunts and, you know, flies to Africa, shoots a big animal, and then flies home, and a year later that the shoulder mount arrives, you know, on a pallet, and they hang it on there. It's very different to shoot an animal, obviously, and to gut it, and to clean it, and to butcher it, and to eat it. So it was that chapter on meat called Meat, which I wrote about butchering a deer and what that was like. It was an interestingly emotional experience for me to write it. So I say all that to kind of confirm, like, sample size of one, that what you all are saying, I think, is exactly right. But still, even as I put that out into the world, and I wonder if you have the same experience with an academic piece, although it's peer reviewed and everything. I mean, you've got a lot of authors. Maybe do you worry about getting backlash from other academics?
Not really.
No. Okay. I mean,
no,
you're in a minority in academia to be encouraging people to hunt and fish. You're in a minority.
That's definitely true. So the reason, but that's kind of why I wanted to say this in an academic paper, and we worked really hard to get this. Nature Sustainability, where we publish this, is undoubtedly the world's leading journal in sustainability science. It's a very credible outlet. And I really wanted to achieve that. So we put a lot of work into this to make sure we had a convincing platform to make these arguments. So I hope we can at least say, okay, you may not agree with this, but we've laid out here a very systematic argument for why we think it's the case. And if you're going to respond, you need to respond in a civilized and logical manner. But yeah, I liked that chapter on meat as well. And I particularly liked, and I think you were saying much the same thing as we are, is that the kill is part of a process, and it has to be part of a process. And it's that process of killing something which is alive and taking responsibility for its death, and then rendering it from a living entity into meat, which you then cook. Hunting has to be a participation in that process, sacramental process with a small s. And that's a completely different thing from when you hunt for a trophy or something like that, where you're not participating in the full process. You're kind of dipping into a bit of it. So we argue that the stewardship potential of trophy hunting is less. Not that trophy hunting is necessarily bad. We don't claim that, but we do say that the stewardship potential, the kind of personal virtue formation potential of something more superficial, is less than when you go through the whole process, from thinking about a hunt to finding the animal to killing it to rendering it into meat to cooking it and eating it. That seems to make sense.
Yeah. And the thesis for listeners, and we'll link in the show notes to the article for people to read. I think people would love it. A lot of my listeners would love it, I'm sure. The thesis in the article then is, when you take part in that whole process, it is more likely to increase stewardship in your own life, care for the environment, care for creation, say that how you will, but that is what some people call consumptive, outdoors recreation, hunting and fishing, as opposed to non-consumptive, like hiking or mountain biking or rock climbing or something. And you do make the point in the article that you think that the consumptive outdoors experience is more likely to lead to a more robust life of stewardship than the non-consumptive. Or maybe you don't say it that plainly, but
I think that's true.
Okay. And why do you think that's true?
Well, it comes back to our starting question, the question that I had also in this 2023 paper, which is, who's going to be the best steward? Perhaps we've talked about this already, but I think it's going to be the person who's most deeply integrated into the system. And I think you become integrated. Well, I think there's a process by which someone becomes intimately linked in this relational framework, this relational anthropology we've talked about. And the first thing is you need experience, nature experience. And the point is that can't be superficial. You can't just go somewhere in a trivial way. You have to go back to the same place over and over again, different times of year and different times of day, different types of weather, until you start to attain to the ability to anticipate what the system's going to be like, what it's going to look like, right? And I give the example of going back to some mossy bank under an oak tree in April, and you know there's going to be primroses there.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've seen them there year after year. Or you go back to some little freezing puddle in February and there might be a frog spawning in there. That takes a lot of time to achieve that. Someone can tell you it's going to happen, but you're not going to that's not going to become part of who you are and how you anticipate the system until you've spent a lot of time. And I think the best way of realizing that nature experience, and this is really important, is through conducting outdoor tasks, doing or participating in difficult tasks which are intrinsically linked to the system. And I think the hunting and fishing are the exemplary cases here, but gardening is a pretty good example as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's tasks in which success actually depends on the extent to which you understand the system and can anticipate it. And those tasks are best conducted in the presence of mentors and so on. People who can reorient your attention and teach you what they know, but who also introduce behavioral norms, right? Imperatives about how you should behave. So there's a kind of process there. But I think there's something about hunting and fishing which really exemplifies that. And there's something about the kill which transforms it. So now you're not just passing through this process, but there's this moment, which I think somehow I always imagine like sinking down into the system. There's some way that you kind of pull the whole ecosystem over your head and you go from walking across the top of it to being grounded right down into it. Like that's where the earth is, that's where the blood is, that's where the trees are, and the water and the weather. And you're really part of it. You kind of realize your predatory place in the system. That is a reasonable ecological statement, but I think it's quite a profound theological one as well.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think you've probably just said it, and you said it in the paper kind of more concisely than I do in my ramblings in the book. Am I right in hearing some neo-Aristotelian, Thomistic, Alistair McIntyre virtue practices?
Of course, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
This is how it works with me. So I'm a Catholic, and I think but I'm constrained in my scientific work by what's going to be acceptable to other scientists. So in my scientific work, I push as far as I can towards the Nicomachean ethics and McIntyre and so on. Yeah. And then I try and pick that up on the other side, in the more kind of Christian Catholic world, where I'm able to speak freely about what I consider to be the fulfillment of all of that. So I'm just starting to write a book myself, which is a collaboration with a theologian here in Ave Maria University, which is going to be about hunting and virtue. And
really?
This kind of thing, yeah.
Okay, well, wait, put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that. Let's then talk. I mean, that I may have lost some listeners with all those names, PhD names, but right. if we can, I think one nice thing I like about McIntyre and that kind of recovery of practices and stuff like that is I think it does make sense to people. I mean, it was what I was trained on in seminary, and when you talk to people in a church about spiritual practices, people are like, oh, I get that. You don't have to obviously footnote McIntyre or whatever, but I wonder then, so people I think have a general understanding in a religious context of how a life of practices will, benefit you and help your faith and etc. But so tell me how that idea of practices or practical wisdom informs this idea of trying to encourage people to hunt and fish.
Yeah, so to take a step back, right, referring to Aristotle believed that the way you build virtue is by striving for excellence, basically, in complex practical tasks. So he was interested in things like horse riding and sword fighting. And he reckoned that if you really tried your best to exemplify these embodied, that is, practical tasks in the company of wise mentors, and that would help you to become holistically a virtuous person. You wouldn't just become a good horseman, you become a better person, where the virtuous man is the one who is oriented towards the common good, basically. So we talk now about not just virtue, but environmental virtue, and draw the conclusion that the person who is the better steward is the one who's achieved environmental virtue. And environmental virtue can be achieved through corresponding tasks. So hunting, for example, or perhaps not just easy hunting, but a really difficult hunting skill like shooting flying birds or fly fishing, something like that, where you're trying to do something which is really difficult and you're trying to develop muscle memory. And as you develop that muscle memory, the ability to do the technical aspects of this task, you also start to absorb the kind of environmental context. So where to fish, which fly to use, what the fish are likely to be doing in a particular system, in a particular weather conditions at a special time of year. And that helps you then not just to catch more fish, but actually as a person to become more likely to do the right thing in the right way at the right time. In this case, not just for the flourishing of the human person, which is the outcome of natural virtue, but for the well-being of biodiversity as well, which is the outcome of environmental virtue.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak directly to that in my own experience of, starting at about age 40, pheasant hunting and not being good, like being the butt of every joke about what a terrible shot I was, and didn't know just the rhythms of that, hunting in a group and how you hunt a field and things like that. And now, 16 years later, I feel like I'm an expert I feel like I'm an expert at pheasant hunting more than I'm an expert at almost anything in the world. There are a few things that I'd be like, oh yeah, I could teach that. And pheasant hunting is one. I don't think I could do that with deer hunting. But with pheasant hunting, I'm like, now a couple things to what you just said. One is that muscle memory of, I was just out shooting clay targets last weekend and I just couldn't miss. It was crazy. And it's just because I've used this gun so many times. And I just remember like reading McIntyre in seminary and I think writing a paper about how a tennis racket becomes part of the tennis players. It becomes more than just a tool they're using, but it's embedded in their practices and blah, blah, blah. This kind of thing.
Right.
And I feel that way about a shotgun. And then also I've just got this accumulated wisdom of we're driving through South Dakota and I can look in a field and just be like, there's no pheasants in that field. Yeah. And oh my gosh, I bet that place is loaded with pheasants because you just, with that experience, so if we can take it a little bit personal for you, what aspect of hunting or angling has have you increased in phronesis over time?
Yeah. Fly fishing. My dad I'm from the north of Scotland where it's all about fishing for brown trout in the hill lochs. You walk up which is wonderful because you walk up the hill by yourself for hours and there's a little bit of water and there's not wonderful fishing and there can be wonderful fishing. But I remember crying pathetically up on the hill at the age 14 because I don't know, my casting wasn't any good, or I just had a rise and I missed the trout, or I broke the line, or I just and again got in a terrible tangle. And I've seen this and trying to teach my own boys to fish. It's just really frustrating. But then eventually it kind of comes together. And now if I pick up a rod, like you say, it just sort of happens. Yeah. And not only can of course, I guess it's not really boasting. I'm old and broken like you. So I think I can probably claim the wisdom. I kind of know where to cast. I know where the fish are likely to be. I know how to place the fly. I know with reasonable confidence whether the weather's going to work or something like that. And that's hard earned. Yeah. But it's obvious. I think it's not unreasonable to say that with that comes personal virtue. You have to learn to be patient. If you have a little tantrum and freak out, you're not going to ever be a good fisherman. Yeah. Or if you get angry and start shouting, or if you are too hasty, you're not going to be a good fisherman. Or if you're selfish, you're probably not going to be a good fisherman. So it's easy to see how these other virtues, these moral virtues, become part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also, I'm just taking up fly fishing now, which I'd put off till my last kid left for college, and he has, and now I have my first Colorado fly fishing trip scheduled for October, and then another one out to Oregon next May.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
You're lining it up.
yeah. I'm trying to. I mean, that's the way these things work. You probably have this too. Well, you actually have a real full-time job, which I haven't had in a while, but a lot of guys have the best intentions. Oh yeah, totally. I'll go fishing with you and blah, blah, blah. And then it comes to time and they're like, hey man, family, job, blah, et cetera, et cetera, which is fine. But I'm one of these guys, I plan it way ahead. And I've actually had a couple listeners give me fly rods, which has been super cool. Yeah. So I've been practicing a little bit this summer, and I know I got a long ways to go, but this is a good reminder. Like, it's going to take real patience for me to learn a new skill that's like a kinetic skill at age 56, just to learn how to cast correctly before I even get into where in the world in this river are the trout,
it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I wonder, then there is one like nuance in your article that's kind of interesting that you struggle with a little bit in print, and that is catch and release fishing.
Yeah.
So because this is also new to me, because I grew up, we fished, we would let some largemouth bass go, but for the most part, we are fishing and we're keeping the fish and we're eating the fish. Yeah. It's not catch and release. But when you get into fly fishing, it's almost like a religion of catch and release from what I've found. So how do you jibe that with the consumptive aspect of your argument?
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that, and the kind of discomfort in that. And I do find it hard to integrate because a lot of the people who do catch and release fishing, I think, do really care about their system.
Yeah.
But I still think that it's those who kill some of their fish that are most likely to be active stewards. In a way, I think part of the power behind the catch and release movement is actually a bit of an error, in the same way I think the sanitization of hunting for public consumption is a bit of an error. It's like, this thing is okay if you kind of take a step back and slightly disengage from your predatory role. And yeah, we're fishing, but we're really nice to these fish and we make sure they survive, and actually we have minimal impact on them. And I think we're being more honest, and I think ultimately it will be more fruitful if we say, actually, it's perfectly legitimate, and actually it's good for us to take some of these fish and kill them and eat them. That's an acknowledgement of who we are and how we function. And it's an engagement with the system, which ultimately, although it seems more costly in terms of the visuals initially, ultimately is going to be better for our care for creation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think that's right. And I'm sure I'll have to practice catch and release on the trout, but I'd also like to go fly fishing for big fish that I can eat, and that's, I hope to do that as my fly fishing journey continues. Okay. So I think your argument's compelling. I think most people who would read it would be like, yeah, it makes sense. But nevertheless, we're, hunting is dying, maybe not quite as quickly as the church, but also, is struggling. And R3 efforts, it's been surprising to me, because a lot of people have been so pro R3 movement stuff, and now sometimes I'm at a conservation organization meeting with one of the organizations I support, and you'll just hear some kind of under the breath chatter of people being like, R3, man, what a boondoggle. It's like people spending money on it.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, sorry. It's like it's this national effort that is now really in big in states. Like, we have an R3 coordinator in Minnesota, which is recruitment, retention, and re-engagement of hunting, of hunters. Okay. It's an effort to grow hunting and fishing, but primarily hunting. And it's been, a lot of conservation organizations, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, backcountry hunters and anglers have all been like pro R3, because it's a way that states are spending dollars to try to increase the number of people who are hunting and fishing, but it doesn't really seem to be working. Yeah. So my question for you is, and it's not really the gist of the article, but How do you think, as an academic who's thought about this and feels like if we have more hunters, it's better for our environment because it's better, it makes stewards.
Yeah.
What do we do? How do we get more people to hunt?
I think perhaps part of the problem has been tendency, as I've said already, to misrepresent what hunting and fishing really are, to make them more acceptable, and then they just become something rather insubstantial and very easy to caricature by an environmental movement which is really generally opposed to killing things. So all I can say is that we might be much better off presenting hunting and fishing in all their kind of holistic beauty and really trying to make this argument. I think that's a fundamental reason for why I wanted to do this article, was to say that hunting and fishing are a really legitimate mode of nature stewardship, and they should be part of the conversation. So, yeah, two things. One is we need to be much more realistic about what hunting and fishing are, and secondly, we need to present them as very legitimate and fruitful components of a plural stewardship approach. But in practical terms, I don't know.
Well, you're an academic. You don't need to know. You just you can.
Yeah, well, I am an academic, but I'm also a hunter and a fisher.
I know. I'm joking.
I really care. Yeah, I know.
This is my next question for you, is like, when you've written a couple of articles now, that are going to be read by some academics and might move the needle in the academic guild of environmental sustainability conversations. But how can you take that to a broader audience, other than coming on my podcast and, maybe Steve Ranella has you on Meat Eater, which he absolutely should, because this article would be right up his alley. And there are a bunch of other, I'll try to get the word out about the article to other people who have bigger podcasts than I do. But is that what your next book's about? Do you foresee, are there organizations that would give grant money to try to get this message broadcast more widely?
Yeah, so we came to America. This is actually, this is really the big life question, basically. We came to America 2 years ago, and professionally, this is what it's all about, really. I want to start something like a Center for Catholic Environmental Stewardship, or something, some large-scale initiative which will use Christian stewardship ideas and natural law stewardship ideas and a very strong element of practice in trying to re-engage people with the earth. So we've started, the first thing I've done here is I've set up a new minor program in environmental stewardship that's starting this fall, and the students will do some theory, they do some philosophy and theology and some ecology and environmental science and so on. We're also setting up a farm. So that's our first stages.
Nice.
On the campus, we're setting up a farm where the students will be able to grow stuff, basically. And I hope have animals. And I hope within a year or two be able to kill those animals and butcher them and cook them. So imagine if we have pigs and part of your class is to go and kill a pig and gut it and cut it up and cook it on the fire.
I love it, man. I love it.
Yeah. That's a way in, isn't it? And then from there, it's easy to see how you can link in hunting and fishing as well. Yeah. So I think we can try and reclaim reality, basically, or try and re-expose these students to reality. It's unbelievable. One of the things we do in the classes here in environmental science is I have the kids go outside and spend 20 minutes without their cell phone. They're not allowed to have their phone. They have to go out and they sit under a tree for 20 minutes and then come back and write a little half-page reflection on it. And it's unbelievable what they experience. Yeah. They're twitching, but then almost invariably they say they saw things and they heard things that they've never heard before. Right. Because suddenly their whole reality is not being mediated by this stupid little digital rectangle. So that's 20 minutes. Imagine if they're out there and they get to kill a pig or they get to grow their own food. And not only are they killing the pig and killing their own and growing their own food, but they're doing that within the context of some theory which can help structure their thinking about it. So some of the virtue theory we've been talking about, or some scientific ecological theory. And so they have the physical practice, they have the practical virtue formation, and they have the intellectual context. And I've set it up as a minor, and I think that's not a bad idea because it means that people or students from all different academic disciplines can integrate this into whatever it is they choose to be. Sure. So even if they want to become, I don't know, some sort of corporate swine, they'll at least have some sort of...
They have killed a swine.
Yeah, exactly. Kill the corporate swine. So that, that's the big mission. That is
great,
yeah.
Sam. I mean, my son my oldest son went to Dartmouth College, which is my alma mater, and it had changed a lot, as of course in 30 years, as a lot of college campuses have. And Dartmouth in my day was always kind of known as the jock boy Ivy League, and up in the woods of New Hampshire. And it still had I think it still does, but the bait and bullet club, which was fly fishing and grouse hunting, was very active. And I took fantastic. My first fly fish casting lessons in the campus green and stuff like that. Then, fast forward 30 years, and my son calls me one day and he's like, Dad, I was just in the dining hall and a group of radical vegans were going up to every table where someone was eating meat and would just start screaming at them that you're a killer, you're a killer. And my son, who's really into powerlifting and really into nutrition, whatever, so his response was about the importance of animal proteins and in your diet and stuff like that. I do wish you would have had another layer of of philosophical / anthropological response to say, let's talk about how important meat eating has been into getting where we are today. That even as a species, we are who we are today in large part because of eating animal proteins and stuff like that. So I'm glad you're training students up and stuff like this, because I don't think this conversation is only going to get hotter as our environment changes and people feel like, they're kind of losing control of what they eat and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as you identify in your book, sorry, I'm just glancing in my email because I was hoping to have something to say, but as you identify in your book, this is fundamentally an anthropological question, isn't it? Yeah. It's about rightly specifying what it is to be human and what the rest of nature is and how we all fit together. And the vegan phenomenon is inevitable in an environmental movement, which is actually ultimately and surprisingly completely dualistic. It says that humans do things bad to nature, and so the solution is to get rid of the humans. And you get rid of them either by having no babies or by closing most of the earth to humans. And I'm saying, no, that doesn't make any sense because we are part of nature and we can't pretend that we can abstract ourselves from the system. And B, actually, perhaps the best thing to do is not to retreat, but to engage ourselves more and more fully and as fully as possible in the system. So, what I'm proposing is exactly the opposite of being a vegan.
I love it. I love it. And it's, I mean, this was one of the things that caught me off guard in the writing of the book is it became clear to me as I was writing it that one of the reasons I was so into this was it put me in touch with my ancestors. Yeah. I mean, it just put me in touch with 100,000 years of Homo sapiens who've come before me and gotten really good at this. And it was a skill that I had completely lost in 2 generations, like a skill that had taken 1,000 generations of human beings to perfect. And then in 2 generations was completely lost between my great grandparents and me. So I didn't know how to butcher an animal. I didn't know how to do it emotionally, much less how to actually physically butcher an animal.
It's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. So, they did know these things, right? So, that was for me a part, and it to your point, it's like, what does it mean to be human? Well, for me, a lot of what it means to be human now is to be involved in these processes, Yeah.
Yeah. To be part of creation.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny how these things matter. I started hunting with a little friend of mine when I was 9 years old. We had ferrets.
Okay.
And we hunted rabbits with them. You go into the woods and you put nets on the holes and then you put the ferret in and rabbits are bounding out and they leap into these nets and get tangled up. Remember,
does the ferret have a leash on, or does the ferret come back?
No, you just leave them go down the hole.
And then they come back to you at the end of the hunt?
Usually they come back. Yeah, sometimes they eat a rabbit and fall asleep and then you sit there for really a long time waiting for it to perk up and make its way back. But I remember the first rabbit we ever caught, 2 of us little boys carrying this rabbit back on a pole on our shoulders, like in the kind of Neanderthal manner.
Oh my gosh.
And that sort of thing's very formative. But you're right. Yeah. It's all part of, we were pretending, like consciously pretending to be cavemen, but I think that's a rather good thing, really. Yeah.
Well, before we go, tell me about your next book. What's the next book you're working on?
Yeah, so the book is really an attempt to figure out this whole hunting, fishing, stewardship thing. So the way we're doing it is I'm trying to write or characterize this argument using sustainability science and a certain amount of virtue ethics. And then Adam Van Wart, my friend here, he's a theologian, so he's going to extend that into Catholic theology, into the way the church expresses this relationality.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how we can link together these two ways of explaining the argument, but the idea is we'll have something holistic and much more accessible representation of the argument, which people can use, I think, to learn, to teach.
Well, that sounds great. I'm looking. Why I'm blanking on his name? Do you know this book called God, Nimrod, and the World?
No, that sounds cool.
Okay, you gotta. Yeah. Okay, and then Father Ted Vitale. I had him on my podcast in 2020.
Yeah.
He is a philosophy. He's a Passionist priest and a professor at St. Louis University, and Barry the Lead, the ethicist for Boone and Crockett.
Okay.
Which is like, the big big.
Actually, I think I've come across him. Yeah.
Okay, so he has an article in there. He may be the only Catholic in that volume. It's edited by a professor at Baylor, whom I've had on the podcast too, God, Nimrod, and the World. But so I mentioned in my book, in the chapter on predator and prey, I mentioned that Jill Carroll, who writes this little article about the cycle of predation, that's in that book. But that book would be a great resource for you, both in thinking about the center and about writing your book.
Yeah.
I mean, there's good and bad in that book, because there's also they interview one of the guys from Duck Dynasty, and here's his theology. Well, God said, subdue and have dominion over the earth, so we get to shoot as many animals as we want. I mean, that's like my synopsis of his 4-page interview,
Yeah, I know. Sorry, God.
I know, right? Exactly. It's like, it's wafer thin theology. But so anyway, I will really look forward to that, and definitely want to have you back on the podcast when your book comes out.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it more.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if I get down to Florida, I'll give you a holler. I don't know. I get down there sometimes. I don't know if you know a Christian theologian named Brian McLaren, but he lives on Marco Island, and he fishes a lot. He would take you out fishing in a heartbeat, man.
Oh, well, there you go. Set us in contact.
I'll hook you guys up, because that
would be cool.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And I really think you'd love him. And we could go on and on, comparing people we know in common or that we should meet. But let's let's stay in touch, because I think your work is fascinating. I hope it spreads far and wide, and then that your book amplifies that message even more. Yeah,
well, thank you. And any connections you can make for me, so much the better. Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Let's keep in touch.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. God bless you. See you later.